In September 1946, the Nuremberg Tribunal reached its climax. The 22 most senior Nazis captured by the Allies on trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity were about to be sentenced. One of the accused was Albert Speer. While the others clung to their plea that they had nothing to answer for in this victor's show trial, Speer, alone of them all, was going to become the Nazi who said sorry.
Officially, what he said, I didn't know. I should have known. I could have known, but I didn't.
Speer, the survivor and strategist, had succeeded yet again.
It was a skillful defense, and he got away with it.
It saved his life. Instead of the hangman's rope, he got 20 years to be served in Spandau prison on the outskirts of Berlin. With nothing to do but tend the garden and remember, Speer was determined the world would know his story. He wrote it all down on thousands of scraps of paper which were smuggled out of prison. Here, in what later became his memoirs, lay his version of the truth about Albert Speer, the brilliant technician who had known nothing about atrocities and who had become the Third Reich's major penitent. Published after his release as Inside the Third Reich, it was a bestseller. Here was Speer's brilliant career as architect and war minister. He was the technician, the pragmatist with no interest in ideology or anti-Semitism, who had loved Hitler and been too ambitious. His sin had been to turn away from the unpleasant truth, to have shunned what he should have known. His penance would be to confess this to the world. This was the Albert Speer that Speer presented to the world whenever the media gave him the chance.
I was thinking as a specialist and not thinking as a human being, and I was so specialized in my job as an architect and other ones that I forgot that humanity is a most important part of life.
He was a very intelligent escapist from the truth, including the truth of his own career. And if that qualifies a man to be called a fraud, then he was.
Others found Speer to be more complex. Gita Serini, a veteran writer on Nazism, spent years trying to probe the enigma.
He was constantly tempted to tell the truth, and he was constantly trying to make someone like me to force him to tell the truth. I pushed him as closely as he could be pushed.
He joined the party in 1931, 2 years before Hitler assumed power. He was studying architecture when fellow students persuaded him to attend a speech by the would-be chancellor. He expected Hitler to rant and rave, but was shocked to discover that he didn't.
He spoke to them about love. Love for their country. Love for each other. Love for work. You know, they sat there, petrified. And Speer said, I thought, am I going home? No, I'm not going home. He just walked through the woods. And he told me, I thought and thought. This was a man who understood us and who loved us. Next morning he joined the Nazi Party.
Speer was born in 1905 to a wealthy patrician family. He grew up in Heidelberg, a prosperous university town, and he was only 9 when the Great War broke out, far too young to feel the pain of defeat. His family was rich enough to survive the years of depression, and the young Albert wanted for nothing. His mother was elegant but stern. His father was an architect and read liberal newspapers, but didn't get on with Albert. Speer was still in his 20s when he married the equally upper-middle-class Margarete. 2 years later, Hitler took power. After politics, architecture was his obsession. Hitler had big plans for the buildings and cities of the new Germany. Albert Speer, newly qualified as an architect, became part of those plans. His first major project for the new Nazi government was his Cathedral of Light, hundreds of searchlights pointed up into the night sky above the vast outdoor Nuremberg rallies. Hitler was thrilled. Nazi symbolism had found its visionary, and the ambitious young Speer would discover this was a good time and place for him to be an architect. Speer now enjoyed what his Nazi rivals prized most, the power bestowed by Hitler's personal favor.
Speer relied on his direct relationship with Hitler. Hitler's empire over these people was personal and absolute. And they competed among each other, of course, and he competed with the rest. But he could rely on this personal link, which very few others couldn't. I mean, even Himmler couldn't.
Speer's feelings toward Hitler were, I can't say they were mixed feelings, because he didn't have mixed feelings. He loved Hitler. No doubt Hitler responded to that. I mean, there is no doubt that Speer, had Hitler wished for a son, this is the son he would have wanted.
Speers Bewunderung war zunächst die banalste Bewunderung, die man sich denken kann. Er war ein junger, stellungsloser Architekt und Hitler gab ihm Aufträge oder Möglichkeiten, wie sie kein Architekt der Geschichte besessen hat, nicht mal Michelangelo oder sonst irgendwer. Auf der anderen Seite hat aber auch Hitler Speer bewundert, glaube ich. Speer war in einer Weise, ja, war das vielleicht, was Hitler, wenn er eine nicht politische Karriere im Auge gehabt hätte, was Hitler eigentlich hätte sein wollen. So souverän, so komplexfrei, so begabt. Und das hat zu dieser fast symbiotischen Beziehung zwischen beiden geführt.
His second big challenge was to do in concrete what he had done before with searchlights, build a permanent shrine for Nazi rallies at Nuremberg. Speer understood what was required of Nazi architecture. This was Mein Kampf built out of gold mosaic and white German stone, perfectly adapted to the dynamics of Führer worship. Speer's next commission was to build Hitler a new Reichschancellery in the heart of Berlin. Hitler's faith in his architect was more than vindicated.
Dann hat Hitler kennengelernt schließlich, dass Speer über außerordentliche organisatorische, und Speer hat das früher als erwartet und früher als geplant zum Geburtstag Hitlers im April 1939 fertigstellen können.
Speer's reward was to be given what for years had been Hitler's dream, the complete rebuilding of Berlin, to be renamed Germania. Other architects had produced designs. None came close to what Hitler wanted.
And then Hitler, totally without preparation or anything else, gave him the plans, said, look at these, tear them up, build Berlin. Germania. Create it.
Speer built this model of what Germania, future capital of the world, would look like. Over 100 feet in length and built with astonishing detail, it stood in its own special room where Hitler would come and inspect it. At its heart was this vast north-south axis, culminating in a dome to be 16 times the size of Rome's St. Peter's.
Dem baulichen Chaos entrissen und endlich eine wahre Hauptstadt des Deutschen Reiches werden. Und möge es Ihnen, mein Führer, dann noch vom Schicksal gegeben sein, in einem neuen und größeren Berlin, das neue und größere Deutschland einer glücklichen, geschichtlichen Zukunft entgegenzuführen.
Ich lege den Grundstein der Beginn der Arbeit des Umbaus von Groß-Berlin.
Hitler would never realize his Berlin plans. Instead, he was to plunge Europe into 6 years of war. While Hitler's advisors urged caution, Speer was thrilled. Poland, the Low Countries, and now France all fell to Hitler's blitzkrieg. Germany would soon have its empire. Speer was at Hitler's side to gloat over their greatest prize. Together they inspected the Arc de Triomphe and Eiffel Tower of a Paris about to be dwarfed by the Germania Berlin was to become. By 1942, the war had changed. The lightning strikes that had annihilated most of continental Europe had ground to a halt on the vast plains of Russia. Speer's war, too, was about to change utterly. The head of German war production, Fritz Todt, was killed when his plane mysteriously exploded in mid-air. He was given a hero's funeral. Who would replace him? Göring wanted the job, but Hitler gave it to his architect. Speer was now Minister for Arms Production, at the very heart of the German war machine, and one of the most powerful men in the Reich.
He had no power base, originally, and his appointment was an astonishment to him and to everybody else.
German military production needed a complete overhaul, and Speer set about his new task with characteristic zeal. Hitler's faith in Speer was once again justified. The architect proved he had a cool organizational mind, just what Hitler needed now that he was fighting a war on two fronts.
The German war economy was geared for blitzkrieg, and this was fine, basically till the end of 1941, when the Wehrmacht was stopped at the gates of Moscow. And what Speer had to do at the beginning of 1942, when he got the job, was to wrench the German economy round from the instant gratification approach of blitzkrieg to the long haul.
But not even Speer could persuade Hitler to use civilian workers, as happened in Britain.
Women were not recruited into the German war machine as they were in the United States and Britain. There were still house servants, as many at the end of the war as at the beginning. There were very few factories worked at night.
He used an alternative workforce, slave labor. The millions of conquered civilians and prisoners of war gathered at his request by his deputy Fritz Sauckel.
Der Reichsminister für Bewaffnung und Munition, Professor Albert Speer, meldet sich beim Führer.
His greatest arms projects were the V-1 and V-2 rockets. Here he proved he could literally move mountains. The RAF completely destroyed the V-2 plant on the Baltic coast. Speer simply moved the factories, lock, stock and barrel, into 10 miles of specially excavated tunnels in old mine shafts beneath the Harz Mountains in the middle of Germany. With Buchenwald concentration camp nearby, Speer had unlimited labor for his rockets. Mittelbau-Dora, as it came to be called, grew into Speer's largest labor camp, complete with its own electric fences and crematorium.
They could be worked to death, literally. I mean, you didn't have to worry about them. You didn't have to provide anything. They just slept where they could on the ground in these terrible underground factories.
While Dora was no concentration camp, it was run by the SS as though it was. And while Dora was the largest of Speer's factories, it was by no means unique. Speer's ministry now ran camps all over the Reich. Ted Misiewicz was in his teens when he was taken from his Polish home and made to work in one of Speer's labor camps on Alderney in the Channel Islands.
We arrived in Alderney in June 1942 and started working straight away. I started in a quarry, and we just quarried the stones for the concreting. It was exhausting, it was debilitating and all the other things, you know, even denigrating and so on, poorly fed. Food was very bad, inadequate, but it was in accordance with German philosophy that provided you last 6 months, you're expendable because they'll bring some more people to work. So eventually you could see them walking, skeletons, just pure skeletons, you know. If walking, and if they fell down, they stayed down, you know, they wouldn't get up.
This extermination through labor made no sense to Speer, the technocrat.
He heard that they were starving, they were being given starvation rations, and that he went immediately to Hitler and said, these people are being given starvation rations, and that Hitler ordered that they should be properly fed. And so I said, well, did you do this out of human compassion? He said, no, because I needed them.
After the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad, and with the Allies pulverizing Speer's factories day and night, it was only a matter of time before the war was lost. By the beginning of 1945, Speer knew it was all over. Hitler had his own plans for defeat, to take the whole of Germany down with him. He gave orders for every last factory, bridge, railway line and power station to be blown up. For Speer, the conscientious manager, it was an act of economic and national insanity. He spent the last weeks of the war desperately crisscrossing the Reich, countermanding these so-called scorched earth orders, an act of treason for which he ran the very real risk of summary execution. Berlin was on the brink of falling to the Russians when Speer, leaving Hitler to his lonely suicide, made the perilous flight out of the capital, joining Dönitz on the Danish border, both of them nursing the fantasy that the Allies would give them positions of power in post-Nazi Germany. But he and Dönitz were rudely awakened to discover they were to be taken to Nuremberg and charged with war crimes.
Albert Speer.
In common with all the defendants, he pleaded not guilty.
Nicht schuldig. Oh, his survival strategy was not to deny his association with Hitler. He admitted that because he couldn't deny that. Not to deny the pride he had as a young figure in the Third Reich. He couldn't deny that. But to separate himself, this is very central to his strategy, to separate himself from the other high Nazis, whom he knew we would discover were a bunch of thugs.
Only then did he break ranks with the others. Speer gave his judges what they wanted most, penitence. He was prepared to shoulder his share of the blame, even for those atrocities he claimed had been kept secret from him. The tribunal, determined not to become just a show trial, was delighted to have a defendant as senior as Speer recognize its authority. Speer's co-defendants were appalled.
Speer made a very plausible defense. Its plausibility was shown by the hatred which he aroused in Goering, who was trying to mobilize the defendants. They wanted to deny everything and to stand firm. And Speer said, yes, the regime was criminal, and I therefore accept that I am guilty, along with all the rest, and that of course didn't please them, for a kind of collective guilt of supporting criminal acts which we imperfectly at best understood.
I stated when I was in the witness box that I am responsible for all those things, for all the slave labor. I didn't avoid telling clearly to the judges what I did, and even I felt responsible when it were orders of Hitler. Others accused, they always were claiming that it were orders of Hitler. I didn't do that.
He never said, I'm guilty. He said, I am responsible, and I accept the responsibility as a member of that government.
There was another question which was occupying my mind very much. This was how much of a responsibility I have to carry from all those things which I didn't know. And I added to this first statement that I also am responsible for everything which happened, and even if I didn't know it, in the time when I was leading man of the government.
But at Nuremberg, the charge against him was quite specific: the criminal use of slave labor. Here his strategy was more straightforward. He would offer up a scapegoat, Fritz Saukel, his erstwhile deputy and now co-defendant, who, unhappily for him, had none of Speer's winning eloquence or social polish.
Speer machte sehr deutlich, dass mit der Beschaffung der Arbeitskräfte nichts zu tun hatte. Er erklärte, dass die Verantwortung dafür, auch für die rechtlichen Grundlagen, allein bei Saukel, jedenfalls nicht bei ihm lagen, und dass nur verantwortlich war für die Produktion und damit für die Anforderung von Arbeitskräften.
I think he won a lot of sympathy from the Western judges, not the Russians. The Russians wanted him hanged, but the Americans and the British, at any rate, I think somewhat fell for the line of the grand bourgeois, who would not have got his hands dirty in the real crimes of the regime.
For some present at the trial, the tribunal's treatment of Speer seemed to go beyond sympathy for his middle-class demeanor. Some kind of understanding seemed to have been reached.
Wenn ich daran denke, dass Jackson Saukel bezeichnet hat als den größten Sklavenhalter seit den ägyptischen Pharaonen, während er bei Speer gesagt hat, er sei beteiligt gewesen an einem Programm zur Beschaffung ausländischer Arbeitskräfte, die immer weniger wurden, also vollkommen ohne kriminelle Substanz, dann kann ich bei einem Mann von Jackson nur sagen, das ist kein Zufall, sondern das war Absicht.
Defendant Fritz Saukel, the tribunal sentences you to death by hanging. Defendant Albert Speer, the tribunal sentences you to 20 years imprisonment.
His relief was ambiguous, however.
His counsel, Dr. Flexner, he had a distinct feeling. He said, Speer never said this to me, but my feeling was that he was almost disappointed. He had brought himself to expect this in a euphoria of guilt, as he called it. And when they said 20 years and others got death, it diminished him in his own eyes.
Whatever Speer's feelings about his sentence and how it had been reached, he now had 20 years alone with his conscience. Once again, he took a different course from his co-prisoners and struck up a relationship with the French army chaplains who conducted weekly sermons. The first was Georges Cassalis.
Mon mari était extrêmement même perturbé à la pensée d'être celui qui allait rencontrer et être confronté avec ces grands criminels de guerre, alors que toute sa vie, toute notre vie en France avait été dans la résistance et au travail pour que cette guerre cesse. Et nous avions des amis personnels qui ont péri en prison, torturés, disparus. La première impression de mon mari, quand il a aperçu Speer, c'était l'homme le plus torturé intérieurement que j'avais jamais rencontré.
Salis simply felt that Speer's guilt was so enormous that it was unmanageable.
Je considère que je suis dans cette prison que le jugement m'a assigné parce que je suis coupable. Et je vous demande, est-ce que vous pouvez m'aider à devenir un autre homme? Il a dit ça en allemand. Ich möchte, dass Sie mir helfen, ein anderer Mensch zu werden. Alors que le andere Mensch, c'est plus fort, c'est plus profond, c'est comme un appel à une renaissance peut-être.
Speer wanted a wider recognition for the new man Hitler's brilliant technician had become, and for the world to judge his career as both Nazi and penitent. Over the course of one feverish year, he wrote down his life story onto 25,000 scraps of paper, smuggled out of prison, edited and typed up by close friends, ready for him to publish on his release. Finally, at midnight on the 30th of September 1966, 20 years after beginning his sentence, Albert Speer was free, reunited with the world. Once again, his future looked bright.
But I can tell you that I'm quite glad to be outside here.
Quelques mots en français, Monsieur Speer.
Oh, monsieur, mon français est trop mauvais.
Quelques mots sur le passé, quelques mots sur l'avenir.
Sur l'avenir. Oh, j'espère que je serai un architecte et que j'ai beaucoup de travail.
Quelle a été votre première impression d'homme libre?
Oh, mon Dieu. Que je suis libre, que c'est beaucoup mieux qu'avant.
As it turned out, there was to be no architecture. Instead, he returned to his comfortable Heidelberg home and became a best-selling author, publishing his Inside the Third Reich to huge acclaim. Hitler's brilliant architect and Minister for War Production had now become Germany's most successful penitent. Even in failure, he had found a way to thrive. This was the Albert Speer that Speer wanted the world to understand. The Nazi with enough integrity to cast an honest eye back on those terrible years. But while there was contrition, there was also pride. Albert Speer was still thrilled by his earlier achievements, though he was now a reformed man. Germany found something deeply compelling about Speer's formula of guilt by proxy, his willingness to shoulder his share of Nazi responsibility, while at the same time maintaining ignorance of atrocities.
War es schon vom Null auf den ersten Platz der Bestliste katapultiert worden. Da fragt er, wie erklären Sie sich das? Und da sagte ich, Herr Speer, das ist ganz einfach. Das ist der Engel, der aus der Hölle kam. Sie sind sozusagen aus diesem ungeheuren Chaos des verbrecherischen Regimes ein Mann aus guter Familie, sehr gut aussehen, erkennbar nicht selber verwickelt in Verbrechen. Sie dienen sozusagen zur Entlastung der Deutschen, wenn selbst Hitlers nächster Minister, den er lange Zeit als seinen Nachfolger vorgesehen hat, nicht eigentlich Verbrecherisches getan hat und noch nicht einmal davon wusste, wie viel weniger können wir, die deutsche Bevölkerung, auch verwickelt gewesen sein in die Ausrottungsmaßnahmen und in den Größenwahn.
But how credible was Speer's position? Could Hitler's second-in-command, whose memoirs flaunted the pride their author took in his unparalleled command of detail, who worked for months in the occupied Eastern Territories, whose trains were commandeered as transports to the camps, whose department supplied steel for construction work at Auschwitz, could he really be telling the whole truth when he claimed to have known nothing? Accusations pursued him, but still he persevered with his version of the past.
The final solution was only declared in 1941. You had been with Hitler for 10 years when that happened.
Yeah, but you know that the final solution was a secret, and it was a secret to me too. Of course, he certainly made hateful remarks about the Jews, as they are in the table talks, but not more. And it's very difficult to find out such a secret even if you are in the government. That's it's a problem.
Je crois que Speer était tout à fait sincère, mais qu'en même temps il se persuadait de sa sincérité. C'est-à-dire, non seulement il voulait dire ce qu'il ressentait, mais peu à peu ce qu'il pensait prenait forme de vérité en lui. C'était pas du tout des mensonges ou des erreurs, c'était vraiment ce qu'il pensait être vrai. J'ai eu l'impression qu'il y avait une espèce d'autosuggestion qui a joué et qui a fait que c'était pour lui une espèce de défense.
Georges disait, s'il avouait qu'il avait tout su, il en serait mort. Et donc, Georges disait, il m'a menti, sur des faits, c'est clair. Et je m'en suis pas toujours aperçue, ou seulement postérieurement. Mais il ne m'a jamais menti sur lui-même, sur sa vie intérieure et sa progression et ses questions, parce qu'il pensait sans doute que je pouvais l'aider à avancer.
And then, in 1971, a bombshell exploded that appeared to shatter Speer's carefully argued version of events. A Harvard academic, Eric Goldhagen, argued that the details of the final solution had not been kept a secret from Speer. In October 1943, Himmler, head of the SS, attended a 4-day conference of senior Nazis in Posen, Poland. He was one of many to give speeches, including Speer. Himmler's speech, however, was no routine party harangue.
And so as I began to read it, I realized the significance of the speech, because Speer had just published his memoirs, in which he denied ever having known of the extermination of the Jews. And there, in that speech, Himmler announces the extermination of the Jews.
Ich meine die Judenevakuierung, die Ausrottung des jüdischen Volkes. Es gehört zu den Dingen, die man leicht ausspricht. Das jüdische Volk wird ausgerottet. Das sagt Ihnen jede Parteigenosse. Ganz klar steht in unserem Programm drin, Ausschaltung der Juden, Ausrottung, machen wir, Kleinigkeit. Und dann kommen sie alle die braven 80 Millionen Deutschen, jeder hat seinen anständigen Juden, sagt, alle anderen sind Schweine. Der ist ein prima Jude. Und so gesehen, es durchgestanden hat keiner. Und dies durchgehalten zu haben und dabei, abgesehen von menschlichen Ausnahmeschwächen, anständig geblieben zu sein, hat uns hart gemacht und ist ein niemals genanntes und niemals zu nennendes Ruhmesblatt.
Anyone who was present at the speech knew everything. I mean, Himmler enumerated very carefully, always avoiding the word gas chambers, but he enumerated very carefully that the Jews of Europe were being exterminated, including the women and children. It was the worst speech that anybody has ever given, I think.
Himmler repeated his speech 2 days later on the 6th of October, the day of Speer's own address. This time, however, there was a change to his text, a change discovered by Eric Goldhagen. Himmler appeared to single out a member of his audience, War Production Minister Albert Speer.
In that speech, Himmler complained that there were German generals and German administrators who were sort of sabotaging or resisting the extermination of the Jews by arguing that Jews are indispensable in certain factories and so on. Then he turned to Speer and said, "You are not one of those," implying that he is a fine Nazi who would not conspire to frustrate the so-called final solution.
Speer responded immediately to Goldhagen's accusations, claiming he had left Posen before the speech, and that Himmler, who was short-sighted, must have failed to notice that he had gone.
Believe it or not, he spent two years in the archives, searching for material to prove that he was not there.
And he produced a piece, a manuscript, which he circulated in Germany, which was afterwards published in a book together with my article, in which he said that he was indeed present at that meeting, but he left before Himmler delivered the speech, and he also succeeded in obtaining an affidavit from one of the officials who organized that meeting, that indeed he had left the meeting before that.
I don't know whether he was there. It cannot be established for absolutely certain that he was there or that he was not there. But of course it makes no difference whether he was there or not, because his friends, the Gauleiters who had all been there, those of the Gauleiters who were his friends, there were three, he saw the very next day at Hitler's headquarters and spent most of the day with them and with Hitler. And of course they told him. If he wasn't there, they told him. It makes absolutely no difference whether he was there or not. From that day he knew.
After Goldhagen's accusation, it became harder and harder for Speer to maintain his defense, even to himself.
I believe that Speer blocked what he could not take. Now, Alexander Mitscherlich, the psychologist, called this Speer's life lie, Lebenslüge. And I agree with this entirely. From the Goldhagen point on, Speer had to lie, consciously lie about his knowledge. He now knew he knew. He now knew he had known. And somehow he had to live with this.
Further revelations since his death, however, have suggested that Speer's complicity went deeper. The latest research has shown that Speer's Berlin housing office had used the SS to evict thousands of Berlin Jews between 1938 and 1942, first to make way for Speer's ambitious rebuilding project, and later to rehouse those non-Jews who had lost their homes to bomb damage. From 1941, these evicted Jews were being loaded onto trains and sent east.
Jedenfalls die erste bis 10. Deportation aus Berlin, das heißt die Deportationen im Oktober und November 1941 und die Deportationen im Januar 1942, nach dem Adressenmaterial, das der Generalbauinspektor zur Verfügung stellte, an die Gestapo zur Verfügung stellte, stattgefunden haben.
Das Judenviertel von Jonava, das gleichfalls nach dieser Anordnung verschont wurde, wird gesäubert. Auch hier terrorisierte das jüdische...
As even official newsreel showed, the East was no place to be a Jew.
in der furchtbarsten Weise.
Amateur footage showed the full horror. Hundreds of thousands of Russian and Polish Jews had been rounded up and shot. By the date of Speer's last deportation in January 1942, these mass executions had become official policy. From now on, the so-called final solution would include all of Europe's Jews, including those deported from Berlin.
Diese gesamte Behörde ist davon ausgegangen, dass keiner der Juden nach dem Kriege zurückkehren würde in eine Wohnung in Berlin.
In other words, 75,000 Jews were expelled from their homes on Speer's orders. Now, that doesn't put him in the engine room of the Holocaust, if you like, but it puts him in the antechamber, doesn't it? I mean, he starts these Jews on the road to perdition.
In later years, Speer would go to extraordinary lengths to seek peace of mind over what his Nazi regime had done to the Jews. He even approached his old Spandau chaplain, Georges Casales, with a difficult request.
Speer continuait à être troublé, enfin torturé par la question juive. Il a demandé à Georges s'il ne pouvait pas lui faire rencontrer des amis qui auraient perdu des leurs pendant la guerre et l'occupation, c'est-à-dire donc des juifs, des juives. Et Georges a hésité, et puis il a contacté deux sœurs judéo-chrétiennes qui avaient perdu plusieurs membres de leur famille à Auschwitz et ailleurs. Et alors ils sont allés, ils ont passé une soirée à la fois terrible et extraordinaire avec ces deux femmes et leurs maris qui lui ont tout sorti, leur haine, leur violence, leur détresse face à l'irrécupérable. Et il a reçu tout ça en disant je dois entendre ça, je ne peux pas me protéger, c'est comme ça. Speer a dit quelquefois j'étais responsable. Je ne sais pas s'il a pu dire j'étais coupable, mais en tout cas responsable, oui. Et ça, il l'a senti très fort ce soir-là.
He corresponded regularly with the Jewish Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal.
Ich habe mit ihm gesprochen über Juden. Wenn ich sage, er war kein Antisemit, da ist sofort die Frage, warum hat er dagegen nichts unternommen, als er gesehen hat?
It was through Wiesenthal that he came as near as he ever would to an admission of greater knowledge about the Holocaust.
Andererseits, ich habe ihm einmal erzählt, dass in Südafrika eine jüdische Zeitung geklagt hat, eine Antisemitengruppe, die geleugnet haben, also den Völkermord an den Juden und so weiter. Und dann habe ich ihm gesagt, wie wäre es, Herr Speer, wenn die Leute Ihnen schreiben und Sie ihnen antworten? Sie sind der beste Zeuge, was Hitler im Sinne hatte. Er hat gesagt, die sollen ihm schreiben. Und ich glaube, er hat ihnen auch geantwortet.
I think what he did finally agree to say, or to let me learn, by showing me this affidavit that he had given to the South African Board of Deputies, where he said that what he regretted most was his tacit agreement, Billigung in German, his tacit agreement to the murder of the Jews. And then when this was published in German in Die Zeit, he added a footnote which said, Billigung, not through knowledge, but through looking away. And I phoned him, and I said, well, what does this mean? You cannot look away from something you don't know. If you looked away, then you knew. And he said, let us never talk about this again.
It was the closest to an admission of guilt he would ever give. Then, towards the end of his life, he found a different way to deal with his past. After 50 years of marriage, he began an affair with a younger woman.
It was the first time he had fallen in love physically. And the person we fell in love with him, who he fell in love with, I believe, was also in love with him. For me, it was sad, because this young woman, who was very nice, but she understood nothing. She told him, but why should you always feel guilty? You are wonderful. You have never done anything terrible in your life. You have never willingly, knowingly hurt anybody in your life. You are wonderful, forget it. And so he gave in and he forgot it.
Speer had worked hard at his guilt. It had been his last great project. But at the end, it was his pride that appeared to have won the upper hand.
And then comes this phone call, which came quite late in the evening. And here was a voice different from the voice I knew so well. And he said, oh, I'm very happy. He said, after all, he said, if you come to think of it, I haven't done so badly, have I? After all, I was Hitler's architect. I was Hitler's Minister of Production Armaments. I did then serve 20 years at Spandau, and I did then come out and make a second career as a writer. It's pretty good, isn't it? I haven't done so badly, after all, have I?
Albert Speer carried on talking about his life and times right to the end. It was after completing this interview for a 1981 BBC documentary that he was taken ill in his London hotel. He died later that night. He was 76. Of Speer's architecture, there remains very little. His rally building, too big to dynamite, crumbles at the edge of a lorry park. The guardhouses he built at the foot of Bismarck's Victory Column are now public toilets. His street lamps still stand, safe in their anonymity. His greatest building, the Chancellery, survived the war, but not the victorious Soviets, who demolished it, though not before cannibalizing the marble as cladding for an underground station, and more symbolically, for their great Berlin War Memorial. Of his reputation, there remains the ghost of an apology, which he spent 35 years persuading himself and the world that he had meant.
Find out what it's like living without a memory. Monday at 9 on UK TV documentary.
In a real Italian pizzeria, the pizza has rich toppings and a crispy, thin base. And that's exactly how Pizza Ristoranti is. Wherever you are, Ristoranti, the pizzeria taste. Ristoranti by Dr. Oetker.
To become a great actress, you need to play lots of different characters and be exceptional every time. My secret? Guess. I choose the most exceptional hair color for me.
It's Preference by L'Oréal Paris. Sophisticated, subtle color at home, which doesn't fade. Exceptionally soft and shiny hair. Preference by L'Oréal.